Okay, so we have seen the major concept of developing web service, soap-based web service using WCF framework in .NET environment, right? So in the .NET, Microsoft is also providing developing the RESTful service. So now we will go to how to develop the RESTful web services using .NET framework, and they have given it name Web API. Okay, so it's a how they call it as a their framework. Basically, it's a open source framework, contrary to WCF, which is closed source. That means the many people can contribute to this architecture of Web API, and the standard can evolve or framework can evolve. And we'll see that there are many benefits of Web API. And before we go to the introduction of Web API, first we'll try to understand the term REST. So let me share my slide. Okay, so see that what is REST? It is an acronym for representational state transfer. So we are going to learn more about what is REST. So this is the term coined by Roy Fielding to describe an architectural style of networked system. Right? So this is not a protocol. Remember, REST is not a protocol. Unlike the other protocol like FTP, TFTP. So in fact, it is not it is de facto standard rather. So people are using it. It became popular, and people are nowadays using the RESTful services. Basically, this person, Roy Fielding, during his doctorate study, he worked on this architectural style called REST, and on the net, it's his dissertation is available for study. If you want, you can download this entire dissertation and study more about it. But we will see the major component of this architectural style. This is how Roy is defining REST. So REST is intended to evoke an image of how a well-designed web application behaves. We have network of web pages, and sometimes they are also called as the virtual state machine, because every web page contains a state. All of you know the state transition diagram, finite state machine, and basically, so we can describe every application in form of this virtual state machine, where the user progresses through an application by selecting links. When the user clicks on links, a state transition will occur and will get the next page. And this next page will reveal the current state of the system. So basically, every time we are clicking on link, a state transition may occur, and this state transition might be to the state itself or to some another state. Okay, and this state is being transferred to the user and rendered for their use. So current state of the system is transferred to the user if the user clicks on the link. So suppose I am clicking some URL that will list all the students in particular branch or particular division, then it will give me the list of students. But if the new student admitted, then I will also get the updated list. Basically, it's a snapshot of the current system, right? So this is a very early concept, and it has been in use since last 2 decades. So it's an architectural style. So he defined the various elements of this architecture. So major elements of this architectural style are components, connectors, and data. So these components are nothing but the computers or network node like proxy server, gateway, or individual computer. Those are connected via the connectors. So we classify this as a client and server. So that those are called as the connector, because on the server a client program might be running or server program might be running. So he defined them to be the connector because actually only the client and server communicate with each other. Only the proxy server and gateway server are placeholder or on which the application is deployed. And the third element is data, which represents a resource. Okay, so it is a general term, resource or representation of the state of the system on the server side. So that means current student list will always include the current snapshot of all the list of students, the student roll number, name, and semester, and other details. Here, this architecture ignores the component implementation details. So how they are implemented is immaterial, and it focuses on the roles of components, their interaction, and their interpretation of data elements. So basically, it's a brief introduction of the REST. So how does it work? We know that there are 3 elements: resource. So this resource on the server can be thought of as, say, here it is a weather report. And there is a URL. Through URL, some specific URL, we are accessing the weather report. And there is a third element called representation. This representation might be the HTML document or XML data or JSON format. So it might have different formats. So it is not fixed that always it will return the HTML, but in general, there is a resource with some specific representation. That means the same resource can have multiple representation. So same student list, I can store it as a XML data, I can store it as a JSON data, or I can store it as a CSV format, right? So this is how it works. You have the URL, using the URL, you are getting the resource, and the state of the system might change. Remember, it might change, not always, because there could be a self loop or self transition. The system will remain in the same state. So basically, we get the weather report in form of HTML document. So why we call it as a REST or representational state transfer? So here is an example. Client is using some URL. So there is a domain name. Port number is not specified. So by default, it is 80 for HTTP. And then there is a path name. So path name is here OAXSEA, right? So that will represent a weather report stored on the server side. So as a response, we get the HTML page containing the weather report. So it could be city, state, or even you can pass multiple parameter for a particular weather report or particular city or state or some region. So the state of the system will be transferred from server to client, and that's why it is called REST. And again, this state might be, this invocation via the URL might change the state of the server, or it may not change the state. For example, suppose I want to update the student record, still this URL can be used to update the student record on the server side. In that case, the state of the system changes because all this data are stored into the database, and that's why the state of the system will change. So basically it was used for architectural model for World Wide Web. So that's why we are using it over the HTTP protocol. Normally it uses the HTTP or HTTPS protocol. So the architecture doesn't mention any protocol, but it gives just architecture. The implementation is up to the developer. Okay, developer will know how to implement this REST architecture or use this REST architecture. And it can be used as a guiding framework for web protocol standards. So it can also be used for standardizing few of the things. So many of all of you know that many of the web services are implemented as a REST base. Sometimes we also call as the RESTful web services. Suppose I want to search the product list from some online shopping website, then they might provide the API endpoint. Through that API endpoint, we can access the list of products. So either it is you need to subscribe. So there are two modes, either it is free or trial version, or it could be paid version. Similarly, weather service, there are number of applications that are implemented using these RESTful services. The entire architecture is now developed using this standard. Earlier, if you know that in web application, entire program, your monolith program is running on the server side. All the request will be handled on the server side. You write down server side script to handle the request. The output will be manipulated on the server side. For example, you already know JSP servlet. You know that this HTML is manipulated on the server side, and this entire manipulated or ready HTML is sent to the client. Okay, so the program or web application running on the server is monolith, means it is not in component. It is not divided into separate component. Okay, all the code run as a single WAR file or jar file. It's something like exe, which is a monolith kind of application, your executable file. So your entire source code is converted to object code or executable file, and then you are running it. And there are many search services, dictionary services, and weather service. Then you have this money conversion service, stock market services, so and so forth, right? So this is an architectural style. Now it is widely popular and it is heavily being used nowadays. So here is an example of parts depot web services. So for particular parts of some system or machine, there is a depot. There they are storing this information about various parts of the machine, and customer can get the list of parts. They can even get the detailed information of a particular part, and they can create the purchase order and submit it to the server side, okay, to the service side. So on the web server, there are web service that provides a different URL, and through different URL you can manipulate, you can do particular job. So first URL1, using URL1 you can get the part list, all the part list. So if you are using over the HTTP protocol, GET request will retrieve all the part list. Similarly, another URL, you can get the detailed information of particular part. So if I give the part number, I can get the detailed information of that part, like part number. Then based on that, it will be able to find out the name of the part, specification of the part, price, quantity, and some other information like images and so forth. So there are two URL, two separate endpoint. Okay, now we call it as a separate on endpoint because to get different information we require two different URL. Okay, the URL cannot be same. And third URL can be used to create a purchase order. Okay, and it will be created on the server side. The web service might also store this information into the database. So that is not shown in this image actually. And what the response you are getting here is a XML format, but it could be JSON or HTML or some other format also. So as you know, using the HTTP protocol, we can receive the response, which can be consisting of the data of particular MIME type. So if the MIME type is say application/XML, then the data is of type XML. If the MIME type is of say application/JSON, then it is JSON format. Okay, the data is in JSON format. And sometime if there is an error, we may also get the response that 404 or some error condition might be written as an HTML format or as an XML or JSON format. So this is how this REST architecture works and how it is being implemented using HTTP protocol. To update the resource on the server, normally we use post. To retrieve the data, we issue the get method. To update the data on the server side, we use put. And if you want to delete the resource on the server side, we use delete. So these are the mainly 4 HTTP verbs or methods used to update the state of the system on the server side. There is also one more. Nowadays, it is also being used, patch. So if you are updating the partial data, then you can use the patch. So there is a difference between put and patch. Normally, this is the by convention that if you want to update all the fields of the record, then you should use put, and only few of the information gets updated. Like suppose I want to update my mobile number, then it should issue the HTTP patch request. Okay, so I'm writing in the right. So there are patch and put. Now you know the difference which one should be used when we are updating the partial data, use patch, and most of the fields are being updated, then you use put. So the client, so your client can be anything. It could be browser or desktop application or anything. This browser, through the browser, this is a URL to retrieve the part list. And what the client is getting is a part list in the XML format. Okay, so here it will have rather XHTML and XML format. So here you get the part ID and a link to the individual part. So the part number is there within they are encoded or embedded within the URL. For example, part number with the part number 345, 346, and so forth. So it should be provided as a link or rendered as a hyperlink. When the user clicks on particular hyperlink, the user will be redirected to a page which will contain the detailed information of particular part. Up to this, it is clear. The URL, endpoint, the response, the state, all this terminology, is it clear? The response you get, Okay, contrary to a SOAP-based service, a SOAP message is created. Here, no SOAP message is created. The data is transferred as part of the HTTP request or HTTP response directly. That means there is not an overhead of SOAP message. The data itself can lie within the HTTP request or response body. And further, state of the system can also be known by the status code. Normally, we'll see that when we are using HTTP protocol, every time we get the response, it gives you the status code. Well-known status code is 404, page not found. Okay, or server is forbidden. Suppose it requires you to authenticate it to the server, then if you are not authenticated and you are directly trying to access the particular URL, then you will be given the response that server forbidden. Right. Now, when we click on particular this URL, so you can see that now the endpoint contains the part number as part of the URL itself. So basically, they are acting as a URL path URL, or even you can pass it as a query string parameter. So once we use this URL to access the or to see the detailed information of the part with the number 345, then we get the response. Once again, it is an XML file which contains the part ID, name, description, specification, quantity. And further, you will see that the specification is not given as the data. It is treated as a link or hyperlink. That means if the specification is containing a lot of data, then user can click on the link to download the specification of that part. So it could be a PDF file or it could be some other form of data. So it is not necessarily always it will be XML or JSON, but it could be some other format as well. So nowadays, these web applications are not developed as a monolith application. It can be developed as a separate component, and they are accessing these web services. And these web services might be running on the same system or different systems, or even your application can access the third-party web API. So the architecture has been changed. Previously, all your code was running as part of on the server, like Tomcat, Apache, IIS, right? Glassfish server. But now your code is running in the browser. So that's why we are having front end like Angular, React, Vue.js, Next.js, different front end frameworks are there. So the code is running inside the browser. Previously, the code, sorry. Previously, the code was running on the server. Now, the code is not running on the server. The code is running on the client or maybe in browser. Is it clear? And if you want to create the purchase order, then submit it via the third URL, and we provide the data along with the post request. Because as you know, if you are requesting the HTTP post request, then the body will contain some data, and that data is nothing but the details about your order. It will contain the order details. And this could be in one of the format like XML. So as a post request, it will be received on the server. On the server side, the web service will store this data into the database. And finally, it can return the response, HTTP response, mentioning whether the PO was created successfully or not. Now, these are the characteristics of a REST-based network. So these are from the dissertation of the Roy Fielding, that is the REST architecture. So here, client-server, a pool-based interaction style. Because normally, client will request the data from the server. Usually, it is stateless because there is no relation between each request. There is no relation between any of the requests. All the requests are independent. And that's why, as you know, HTTP is a stateless protocol. We can easily use HTTP protocol to use this REST architecture. Caching can be used to improve the network efficiency. So network nodes are classified as either cacheable or non-cacheable. Do you know how the caching works on the internet? Any idea? Any idea about caching mechanism? Different kinds of caching mechanism used over the internet. Okay, DNS cache. Then no, caching means caching the data so that it need not go to the server. The data can be immediately written from the node, from that particular node. Correct, to improve the access time. Correct. That is the benefit of cache. So the caching mechanism is right. So it is CDN. One of the widely used mechanism is CDN, content delivery network. Many of the data is stored as a cache or through the cookies on the client side. We know that, like session, user session, or personal details of the user. So cookies are also one kind of caching mechanism. And that's why if you are visiting some another website, many of the company will show you advertise based on your past search. Because those information or your searching data is cached on the browser cookies. Okay, browser will, as part of the browser cookies, your information will be maintained. And based on that, they can recommend different products. So in form of cookies, then we have the CDN. Okay, so many of the websites, many of the companies now, they are using CDN. And another benefit is distributed, like to handle many clients, millions of clients. We do not have a single server. Many servers are there. For example, YouTube uses CDN. So suppose there is some video created in, say, US. It has gone viral. Okay, and now you are trying to view that video. So what happens in India? One of the CDN server in India will cache that entire video. And the people browsing or viewing that video will get the video directly from the CDN server. Instead of fetching the entire video from the US server, they are stored onto the CDN server. And that's why you get the better speed. And the access time is less. So this is caching mechanism. So see that in theory, they are just writing it cache, and how they are implemented via the different mechanism or different protocols. So many of the libraries, APIs are nowadays, they use CDN to cache the data. But again, there is a possibility of whether the data is up to date or not. Normally in the video, it is updated less frequently, then CDN will be very much helpful. But suppose you are downloading student data and if there is a change in the student detail, you might get the stale detail, right? Then uniform interface. So we are using the standard interface like HTTP GET, POST, PUT, DELETE, patch. All the resources are named via the path name in the as part of the URL, because URL is unique. No two resource can have the same URL. Remember, every resource must have a unique URL. And all these are interconnected. This resource representation are interconnected, like we have seen in the previous slide, that if we get the part list, then from that we can go to the part detail, and from that we can move on to the specification of the part. Now these are the principles of this web service design using REST architecture. So first you identify all the conceptual entities that we wish to expose as services, like I want to expose part list, detailed part information, PO, order information, and so forth. Then create a URL for each resource. Then categorize this resource, whether it will change the state or not. So if it doesn't change the state, use the HTTP GET. If it changes the state, then use POST, PUT, or DELETE. Now, if you are using HTTP GET, then the request should be side effect free. That means it should not change the state of the system. And hyperlink are used to further drill down. Like we have seen, from part number, part details, from part detail to specification, and designed to reveal data gradually. Okay, so that means in one URL, you don't try to fetch all the details. That will unnecessarily increase the bandwidth of the system. Okay, suppose there are say thousands of record, and all the thousands record will be transferred from server to client. It will increase the bandwidth because the user is not interested in all the details. At a time, we are interested in the brief details of the different parts. And once we are, if you want to look at the more information, we can select the particular part. And this data can be represented using some format. For that, you can use DTD, schema, and some other protocols. So these are some older standard, RelaxNG and Schematron. And finally, you have to describe the services, whether they use visual document or directly an HTML document. So do we require this information to be available on the broker or not, web service broker or not? So nowadays it is the architectural style widely used, and it is the style used for web standards. Now we'll see what is ASP.NET Web API. So Web API is the framework for .NET used to develop the RESTful web services. And now there are two versions. It is available for .NET Framework as well as .NET Core. So remember, we will be using .NET Framework to develop the Web API. We will not use the .NET Core. Newer project might use the .NET Core to develop the RESTful web services. And they might also use along with the MVC or entity framework. So we will not go into complex the things by adding MVC and EF. Our examples would be as simple as possible to start with. So that this web API, we are creating project in the .NET framework. API full form, it is used to HTTP services, build HTTP services. So in WCF, we are worried about the transport. Okay, there we can specify the transport. In web API, we must use the HTTP protocol. So either HTTP or HTTPS protocol. So there you have flexibility of using TCP or UDP or pipe or message queue. But here only HTTP or secure HTTPs are used. WCF is not open source. Web API is open source. That means even you can contribute to this style, this framework. And using WCF, you can use create the SOAP-based web services. And some of the binding also supports creating RESTful services. But now it is not recommended to use that. Use the web API, which is the newer standard or newer framework, to create the RESTful services. So that means in WCF, you can also create the RESTful services. But they have come up with the newer framework. So we are using the newer framework, web API. So this is the architecture. You can see that you have the ASP.NET Core or at the bottom, a .NET framework. On top of that, you are using MVC or web API. And on top of that, you have the data in the form of HTML, XML, or JSON. So either you can create web forms or web pages, or you can use the MVC. Nowadays, if you are using web API, they provide the option of MVC to create or scaffold your project that uses MVC framework. So what is the benefit of web API? So previously what happened? Web server was running the business logic. At Tomcat, Apache, IIS, you are writing server-side script in PHP, Python, JSP, Servlet, and you deploy it onto the web server or application server. So your business logic is running inside that. So that code will access the database to fetch the data. And this data would be rendered on the, or rather rendered on the server side and sent to the client. So the client are, normally we use the browsers, Firefox, Chrome, Internet Explorer, or Opera, or some other browsers. So this is the previous architecture, but now you can also directly access this data using the web services, or you build specialized applications that are running like mobile applications, which are directly accessing to the database. So this were the previously how the data was accessed. In the newer version, all the client, whether it is a mobile application or browser or desktop client or any form of client, directly talking to the web services. Okay, they are directly talking to the web services, and web services have the business logic to connect it to the database. So this has been standardized because in the previous architecture, you require a different logic for mobile application and different logic for the client application that is accessing the website through the server, through the browser. So whether it is a mobile application or application we are browsing through the browser, we had different standard or different means of communicating. But now, using the same standard, same endpoint, we can access the data, irrespective of it is a browser. So and this is the service oriented architecture. Now you are decomposing your entire software architecture in form of web services and the client app. So that might be running a front end, that might be using front end framework and running the code inside the mobile application, or it might be within the browser accessing the web services endpoint and fetching the data. Another benefit is because they are using HTTP protocol, that means now the client app is independent of particular language because all of them can use the HTTP protocol. So language platform is immaterial. Whether it is a Windows operating system or your Android OS or Apple OS or a browser running in any platform, you have the same endpoint. There is no change in the endpoint, and still they can access the data or manipulate the data. So basically, you get the interoperability. Your client can be written in any language. Okay, your client can be written in any language and on any running on any platform, on any operating system. So what it does, nowadays we are using ASP.NET Web API. This is the nothing but the RESTful web services. They so there are different clients, browsers, desktop application, an app running on mobile, or it could be some any application, console app, which can directly connect to the web service, this web API, and fetch the data through the HTTP request and retrieve the data in JSON or XML or any other format. And web API through the, maybe this entity framework might be optional, but if you normally we use it, which is through which we are connecting it to the database. So you can develop the project without entity framework also, or without MVC also. But once you learn all of the things, it is recommended that you can use all of the framework like entity framework as an ORM to connect to the database, MVC as a design pattern, and your web API to write down the services. So that is the benefit of the web API. Any client written in any language, irrespective of the type of application, can access the data. And this is the .NET model for the. And similar model can be there for other language like PHP, Python, Java. You can also develop the RESTful web service. The architecture would be similar. There, this ORM framework might be different, like Hibernate Spring, but ultimately you are fetching the data through the database via that framework. And web API will provide the resource through the different hyperlinks. What are the features of web API? It's a modern HTTP programming model. A strongly type HTTP model. Now, there are benefits of HTTP, the content negotiation. So the client can negotiate with the server to provide the appropriate type of data. That means client can ask the server, please provide me the data in XML format. I can understand only XML format. Or client can tell the server or web service that provide the data in JSON format or some other format. So these are that is called content negotiation. And not only that, we can also have our custom format other than the standard format. Do you know how this content negotiation works? through the browser. How the client can tell to the service that it wants to download the data in particular format. No, through HTTP request. All of you know that HTTP request is divided into two parts: header and body, right? So within the header, there is one type of header. Do you know accept header? You might have seen this accept header. I will write it down in the chat box. We can say accept application slash JSON. That means it's a request from client to the server that it can understand JSON data. So you can have application slash JSON or text slash JSON. Likewise, you can provide. Fine. It provides the feature of query composition. So automatic paging and sorting can be provided because as part of the URL, you can provide directly the page number and you can fetch the details of stored in that page only. Now there are other features of this web API. Model binding and validation. All of you know POCO. Plain old C# object. So it doesn't contain the methods. It's similar to the Projo. Plain old Java object. Here it is plain old C# object. So it doesn't contain the methods. It contains only model. So the data it will contain only the data. So normally when we are exchanging the data between client and service, only this model data will be shared between the two. So Web API supports this model binding and validation. So validation can be done by attribute. For example, say your roll number should be numeric or your mobile number should be only numeric. Then email address must follow some regular expression. So those kind of validations are directly available. So I don't know whether you've done that in .NET subject in the previous semester or not. In MVC or probably in MVC, have you done this data validation? Okay. So here also there is a support of data validation directly as the POCO model, and binding and validation as part of the infrastructures are supported. That means MVC is supported. Correct. So in EF Entity Framework and .NET Core. Right. So framework also supports the routing. So based on the route, it can invoke the appropriate controller. That in MVC, you can invoke the particular controller through the route or URL. So in Web API, it is supported routing. Authentication or course request are supported, and you can use them in your web service. There is you can easily test this web API services